So Year 10, this is the second lesson in the second unit, B1.2, Respiration and the Respiratory System in Humans. So in the first lesson, you learned about aerobic respiration and a little bit about anaerobic respiration. In this lesson, I want you to carry out at home an investigation into the effect of exercise on heart and your breathing rate. So to begin with, you have to ensure that your pulse and your breathing rate is at rest. So you need to find a nice quiet spot on the sofa, sit yourself down, okay? Sit quietly for a minute so that your heart rate slows to its resting pulse rate and your breathing rate slows to its resting breathing rate. Find your pulse either in your wrist or your neck. Do not use your thumb as this has pulse of its own. So you normally take 2 fingers, as you can see in the diagram, and you place them gently on your wrist. You do not have to press hard. If you press hard, you will not feel the pulse. So you need to find your pulse. If you can't find your pulse in your wrist, and a lot of people struggle sometimes to find their pulse in their wrist, especially at rest, the best way is to find where your jawline is on your face. Put your 2 fingers on your neck just below, immediately below your jawline, where the jaw comes across. And then twist your head just slightly, turn your head into where your fingers are on, if it's the right side of your neck, the right side, okay, or if it's the left side, the left side. And hopefully just applying just very light pressure and twisting your neck just slightly towards where your fingers are, you will be able to pick up your pulse rate. So what I need you to do is to measure your resting pulse rate 3 times. So take your resting pulse rate, how many times you feel that pulse, that push of blood through the blood vessel, okay, in 1 minute. Repeat it again, second time, repeat it again for a 3rd time. If you get one result that is higher or particularly lower than the other 2, we would call that result an anomalous result, and I would ignore that result. You need to be getting your results to be very similar to one another, okay? If they're massively different, there's something going wrong somewhere. So this is your rate at which your heart beats before exercise. Once you've got your 3 results, you add them together, you divide by 3 to take your average, and you record it in the table below. You're then going to do your resting breathing rate because you're still at rest. So this is an ideal time to do this now. 1 breath in and 1 breath out counts as 1. So you're going to sit there very calmly, okay? Measure your breathing rate. As I said, 1 breath in, 1 breath out is 1 breath. Do that 3 times over a minute. Take the breathing rate over a minute. Add those together again and take an average. And again, if you get one result that is a little bit unusual, it's higher or lower than the others significantly, then repeat it. Then for looking at both your pulse rate and your breathing rate after exercise, I don't mind what type of exercise you do, whether you stand on the spot and jog for 1 minute, whether you get on a running machine, whether you're bouncing on a trampoline out in the garden, okay? Whatever it is you're doing, you need to do some kind of activity that's going to hopefully raise both your heart and your breathing rate, okay? So you do the activity for 1 minute, and then you take your pulse rate for 1 minute and you record it, and hopefully you should see that that's gone up. You do it again, the exercise for 1 minute, take your pulse rate, record it in the table, and final time, 3rd time, do the exercise for a minute, pulse rate, record it. Then you do exactly the same exercise for the same amount of time, the same intensity. That's really important. That's a control variable. And you measure your breathing rate. So again, you jog on the spot or bounce on your trampoline for a minute, okay? Take your breathing rate straight after for a minute. Do it again and do it a 3rd time. And again, take the average and record the results in your table. So in this investigation, our independent variable is the one that we're changing. So we are changing whether we're at rest or doing some kind of activity, exercise. Our dependent variables, because we're measuring 2 different things in this investigation, are the pulse rate and the breathing rate, and the control variables, the things that we keep the same to make it a fair test, okay, they are the same type of exercise, the same intensity of the exercise for the same amount of time, okay, and the same person, obviously, okay. Why did we repeat each experiment 3 times? This makes our results reliable and repeatable if they are similar, okay? So we're looking for getting similar results each time. If somebody else did this experiment and repeated it as well, okay, that would be looking at whether our experiment was reproducible if they had similar results to yourself. What do we call an odd or unusual result that's perhaps too high or too low? We call it an anomaly. So we spell anomaly, A-N-O-M-A-L-Y. And what should we do with anomalous results? Okay, we ignore them when calculating our average. If we can, we repeat that experiment again to get a third result. If not, we would take the average perhaps of the 2 bits of data. So once you've collected your data in your table, I now want you to draw a graph. So on page 5, you have got some graph paper. It is a bar chart that you're plotting because our independent variables, okay, with exercise, without exercise, okay, are going to be categoric. Our dependent variables, which are our pulse rate and our breathing rate, are going to be continuous variables because they are numbers. So you can either choose to do 2 separate smaller bar charts with separate scales on the y-axis for pulse rate and breathing rate, or you can combine them together in one bar graph with the pulse rate and the breathing rate recorded. But think carefully about your choice of scales. Don't forget that bar graphs need to have labels on the axes. Those labels need to have units. So it would be pulse rate is beats per minute. Breathing rate is breaths per minute, okay? And obviously it would be the average for both of them. And you also need to have a heading. So plot your graph, and then the final bit of this task is to write a conclusion. And your conclusion is what you have found out, including an explanation of why, okay, your breathing and your pulse rate go up. So generally we find out that our pulse rate and our breathing rate increase after exercise. Why does this happen? Well, first of all, your heart needs to work much harder, faster, as it's a muscle to pump the blood around the body. The reason why is it needs to get the blood containing the oxygen and the glucose to the body cells so they can carry out respiration and release energy. Remember, we do not say that energy is made or produced, it is released. The breathing rate increases in order to get more oxygen into the lungs through the little structures that we call alveoli that we'll look at in a later lesson, into the bloodstream so it can be delivered to those cells, okay, particularly muscle cells, okay, to allow us to move, okay, in our activity when we're doing our exercise, okay. So make sure that you've given me an explanation as well as a description of what's happening. Now, on the next page, on page 6, it talks about anaerobic respiration. And you might have experienced this, okay, at some point during the time, because anaerobic respiration is respiration that happens in the absence of sufficient enough oxygen. Can you see in dark black, okay? The dark black is for higher tier only. It is less efficient than aerobic respiration. What we mean by this, it releases, okay, less energy, okay? So it's less efficient than your regular aerobic respiration because the glucose does not break down completely. Incomplete breakdown of glucose. As a result, less ATP is produced per molecule of glucose in anaerobic respiration than in aerobic. And I've put in brackets a little H underneath, okay, after that, because that is higher tiered. That sentence just in itself, or those 2 sentences, are higher tier only, about knowing about why anaerobic respiration is less efficient. But foundation tier, you still need to know what anaerobic respiration is. So it's respiration without oxygen. It normally only happens for a short period of time, and different organisms produce different products when respiring anaerobically. So in humans, when we respire anaerobically, we create something called lactic acid, and it's lactic acid that causes us to get cramp. So you might have experienced this perhaps at night, okay? You might have been woken up and your leg or your arm has gone a bit dead, okay? You get pins and needles, you can't feel it. And this is because perhaps you've been lying awkwardly in bed and leaning on your arm and leg and cutting off your blood supply temporarily so that not enough blood can get to the muscle cells. So what happens is the muscle cells start respiring without oxygen, in other words, anaerobically. They still release energy, but they release less energy. And as a byproduct, they make lactic acid, which has caused the cramp and why you've woken up. Another way to demonstrate this so that you can all experience what lactic acid buildup is like in your body is to raise your arm directly above your head, preferably your arm that you write with, okay? Don't have your arm all floppy. Don't hold your arm up with the other arm, okay? It's got to be directly above your head. And start to clench and unclench your fist for as long as you possibly can. Then you clench and unclench your fist double time. You go faster. And after a while, your upper arm and your lower arm will start to ache. You get a burning and a tingling sensation, the pins and needles type sensation. And the reason is that because your arm is above your heart, you're holding it up. The heart has got to work extra hard to pump the blood containing the oxygen against gravity to get to those muscle cells in your arm to allow your hand to clench and unclench. So because the heart is not able to pump this oxygenated blood as quickly, as efficiently against gravity up your arm, your muscle cells start to respire without oxygen, in other words, anaerobically. And as a result, they produce this lactic acid that causes the burn, the tingly type experience. And as I said, you may have experienced this out on the racetrack during PE, especially during something like a sprint when you're doing an activity that is quite quick and requires a lot of effort in a small space of time. You find that lactic acid gets produced. So swimming, if you're doing a length, okay, as a race, you find that sometimes you can get cramp because your cells start respiring anaerobically. Lactic acid is not good for us. It basically can poison your muscles, causing fatigue and stopping them contracting efficiently and leading to cramp after heavy exercise, okay? You also will find that at the end of that exercise, okay, you often see that athletes start to breathe faster and deeper. So literally they might bend over at the end of the race and start breathing in faster and deeper. This is so that they take in extra oxygen into the blood, and this oxygen will oxidize the lactic acid into carbon dioxide. We say that this extra oxygen needed to oxidize the lactic acid back into carbon dioxide and water is called the oxygen debt. So the oxygen debt has to be paid back after we exercise by breathing harder and deeper to get more oxygen in. It's not only our cells that respire anaerobically, it's also some microbes, bacteria and yeast can respire anaerobically. And when they respire anaerobically, they produce alcohol as their waste product. So we can see in this equation, glucose releases alcohol as opposed to lactic acid, some carbon dioxide and a little bit of energy. And this is beneficial for making bread. So when we use yeast to make bread, the carbon dioxide helps the bread to rise. That's why you get the little bubbles, okay? But we don't get any alcohol in our bread because as soon as you put the proven dough into the oven, the alcohol will burn off, okay? Right, second task. Again, this is a graphing task. This young lady here in the picture is Marion Jones in the 2000 Olympics, okay? And we've got some data on Marion Jones. I will put a little link to Marion Jones's race, her sprint, okay, from the 2000 Olympics, because it's pretty exciting, okay, in terms of the distance that she did in the time that she did it in, okay? And we can see on our scale, we've got the time in seconds, okay? So going up to 80 seconds. And we've got lactic acid just recorded in regular units here. Now, you've got some graph paper over on the next page. So that would be page 7. You need to draw a graph of this data, and this graph should be a line graph. Time will be on our x-axis, the axis going across. Don't forget the units, don't forget the label. Lactic acid units will go up the side, okay? And the units are just units, okay, for lactic acid up the y-axis. So you plot your points, and then you should join the points together in a curve. And what you should notice is that our graph increases really quickly to a maximum of 12 at 30 seconds, and then it starts to decrease over and above 30 seconds. So from her graph, once you've plotted it on the next page, I want to know, when did her lactic acid levels reach a maximum? Can you explain why? So if she's making lactic acid, that lactic acid has come from anaerobic respiration. It means her muscle cells are working so hard and fast, her heart cannot get the blood containing the oxygen to those muscle cells quick enough. And so temporarily during this sprint, okay, they make lactic acid by anaerobic respiration. That builds up in her muscles. And what will happen is at the end of the race, okay, quite often athletes almost collapse because the lactic acid is built up to such a point that their muscles can't even allow them to stand. You'll also find that sometimes they just crouch down like she is in the picture, and they start breathing hard and fast, okay, after the race, and this is to pay back the oxygen debt. So over the page, you've got your graph for plotting. And just a couple of other questions here. Why is marathon running more efficient than sprinting? In marathon running, you keep a regular, steady pace, and you are breathing constantly, okay, and fairly consistently in order to get oxygen to the muscle cells. Whereas sprinting requires far more effort. You might take 1 or 2 breaths only during that sprint, okay? So a 400-meter runner may be out of breath for as long as 3 minutes after their event has finished, as they start breathing hard and fast at the end of the race to oxidize the lactic acid and pay back what we call the oxygen debt. So complete the graphing task on Marion Jones. And then your final numeracy task, okay, is about Stacey running the marathon. So Stacey is training for a marathon. She uses something called a spirometer to find out her breathing rate and the volume of air that moves in and out of her lungs. And I know that Mr. Hancock has recorded a little video of using a digital spirometer that we have in the department, and you'll be seeing that a little bit later in the booklet when we cover the work on spirometers and peak flow meters. So it measures the volume of air that moves in and out of her lungs with each breath. And the graphs show a printout of Stacey's results. So this is actually a practice GCSE question from a few years back, okay? We've got the graph on the left is her printout from breathing at rest. So this is when she's at rest. And the graph on the right is from breathing during exercise. Both of them are recorded just in 1 minute. So we can see our scale along the bottom axes here, both recorded in 1 minute. That we can see there. And we can see the volume of air in the lungs. So if we look at the one at rest, the one on the left, okay, we can see that this number here would be 2,500 at the bottom. This is 3,000. So the volume of air in her lungs that she's breathing out, and we can see a breath in, a breath out. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So she makes 8 breaths, okay, in that time. She's breathing in and out 500 cubic centimeters, okay, of air in her lungs at rest, okay, with each breath in and out. Whereas at exercise, from 2,000 up to 3,500, she's breathing in 1,500. And you can see not only is she breathing in a greater volume, but we have 1 breath, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 breaths. So she's making more breaths in the time period than she did when she was at rest. So you have to calculate how much more air did Stacey take in per breath whilst exercising than at rest. So what's the difference between the volume here, the 1,500 and the 500? So that's fairly straightforward. Please show your workings out and the correct units. The spirometer trace shows that Stacey breathed more quickly and deeply during exercise than she did at rest. This is because the working muscles need extra oxygen to release more energy by respiration. After a few minutes of exercise, Stacey's legs began to ache. Explain what the reason for this might be. So you should be starting to link that up with the fact that perhaps some of her muscle cells are starting to carry out anaerobic respiration. As they're respiring anaerobically, they're going to be releasing lactic acid, and that's what causes the ache. And then this last question. This is a problem-solving question. It involves ratios, okay, or fractions, depending on which method you use to work out. So Stacey said if you train for 6 hours a week, you should eat 5 grams of carbohydrate for every kilogram of your body mass. Stacey has a mass of 60 kilograms. So she trains not 6 hours, she trains 9 hours. So the first part, you would show how much carbohydrate she needs if she was training for 6 hours. Then you would divide that by 2 to work out how much it is for 3 hours, and add that same amount of carbohydrate in the 3 hours to the 6 hours calculation, and that would give you your total carbohydrate she should be eating in her daily diet. Again, don't forget to show your units in this answer. And that's the end of the second lesson.